September 26, 1983. A Soviet officer sits alone in a bunker beneath Moscow, staring at a screen that's telling him the United States has just launched 5 nuclear missiles aimed directly at his country. He has minutes to decide: launch a counterstrike and start World War III, or trust his gut that something is wrong. The fate of hundreds of millions of lives rests in his hands, and almost nobody on Earth knows it's happening. The Cold War powder keg. To understand how close we came to annihilation, you need to understand just how terrifying 1983 really was. This wasn't just another year in the Cold War. This was the year when the tension between the United States and the Soviet Union reached levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis 20 years earlier. And the world had become a chessboard where 2 superpowers moved their pieces closer and closer to checkmate, and everyone else was just hoping the board wouldn't flip. Ronald Reagan had become president of the United States 2 years earlier, and he wasn't playing the diplomatic game the way his predecessors had. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire in public speeches. He pushed for a massive military buildup. He announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a space-based missile defense system that the Soviets saw as a direct threat to the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction that had kept both sides from destroying each other. On the Soviet side, the aging leader Leonid Brezhnev had died in 1982, replaced briefly by Yuri Andropov, a former KGB chief who was deeply paranoid about American intentions. Andropov genuinely believed that the United States was preparing for a first strike, a surprise nuclear attack designed to wipe out the Soviet Union before they could respond. Both sides had thousands of nuclear weapons pointed at each other, ready to launch within minutes. The doctrine was simple and terrifying. If one side launches, the other side launches everything they have. Nobody wins. Everybody dies. Cities vaporized, billions dead. Nuclear winter consuming what's left of civilization. This wasn't a video game or a movie scenario. This was the actual military strategy that governed global politics. One mistake, one misunderstanding, one faulty computer chip, and it could all be over. And in 1983, mistakes were happening with alarming frequency. The cascade of near disasters. The year began badly. In March, our President Reagan gave his evil empire speech, which sent Soviet leadership into a state of heightened alert. They became convinced that American aggression was escalating towards something catastrophic. Then in September, things got dramatically worse. A Korean Airlines passenger jet, Flight 007, accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters shot it down, killing all 269 people on board, including a United States congressman. The world was outraged. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. The Soviets claimed it was a spy plane. Trust between the superpowers, already thin, evaporated completely. But the Soviets had another reason to be on edge, something the West didn't fully understand at the time. Soviet intelligence had convinced their leadership that NATO was planning a massive military exercise called Able Archer 83, scheduled for November, and that this exercise might actually be a cover for a real nuclear first strike. Soviet military doctrine assumed that any nuclear war would begin this way, disguised as a training exercise so that when the missiles launched, they would be real. The KGB had put out an alert to all their intelligence stations across Europe. Watch for signs that Able Archer was going to go live. Watch for NATO commanders moving to secure locations. Watch for unusual communication patterns. Watch for anything that suggests the exercise is about to become an actual attack. The Soviet military went to an unprecedented state of alert. Nuclear bombers in East Germany and Poland were loaded with live warheads and placed on standby. Submarines moved into attack positions. The leadership genuinely believed they might have only days or hours before American missiles started flying. This is the world that Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov walked into on the night of September 26th. The night the system failed. Stanislav Petrov was 44 years old, a software engineer turned military officer who was covering someone else's shift at Serpukhov 15. a secret bunker south of Moscow that housed the Soviet Union's early warning system. His job was to monitor satellites that watch for the heat signature of American intercontinental ballistic missiles launching from their silos. If the system detected a launch, Petrov's responsibility was simple: report it immediately to Soviet High Command so they could launch a counterstrike before American missiles hit their targets. Response time was everything. The missiles would take approximately 25 minutes to reach Soviet soil. That meant Soviet leadership had maybe 10 or 15 minutes to decide whether to end the world. It was just after midnight when the alarm went off. The computer system, called Oko, which means eye in Russian, lit up with the word launch in bright red letters. One of the satellites had detected a missile rising from an American base. Petrov's heart jumped. This was it. This was the nightmare scenario everyone had trained for. But then he looked at the details. Just one missile. One single missile launching from the United States toward the Soviet Union. Petrov's mind raced. Why would the Americans launch just one missile? It didn't make tactical sense. If you're starting a nuclear war, you don't fire a single missile. You fire everything at once to overwhelm the enemy's defenses and destroy their ability to respond. One missile could be shot down. One missile wouldn't accomplish anything except guarantee your own destruction when the other side launched their thousands of missiles in response. It had to be a false alarm. It had to be. But the system kept screaming at him. Launch, launch, launch. He made a decision. He picked up the phone and reported to his superiors that the system had malfunctioned. It was a false alarm. There was no missile. Then the system detected a second missile, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth. 5 missiles now, all launching from American bases, all heading towards Soviet territory. The computer had the highest reliability rating possible. The satellites were functioning normally. Every technical indicator said this was real. Petrov's subordinates stared at him, waiting for orders. The protocol was clear. He was supposed to immediately alert the Soviet leadership that the United States had launched a nuclear attack. The generals would then have minutes to decide whether to launch a full retaliatory strike while they still could. Petrov looked at the screen again. Still only 5 missiles. 5 missiles out of the 1,000+ that the United States had in their arsenal. It still didn't make sense. Why would the most powerful military in the world start World War III with just 5 missiles? His training told him to trust the system. His instinct told him the system was wrong. The phone to Soviet High Command was in his hand. One call and the machinery of nuclear war would start moving. Maybe the Americans really had launched. Maybe this was some new strategy he didn't understand. Maybe he was about to make the worst mistake in human history by not reporting an actual attack. Or maybe he was about to save the world by trusting his gut. He reported it as a system malfunction, false alarm, no missile launch, stand down. For the next several minutes, Petrov sat in that bunker, sweating, heart pounding, wondering if he'd just sentenced millions of Soviets to death because he'd ignored a real attack. If American missiles were actually in the air, they would hit their targets in less than 20 minutes. Soviet cities would start disappearing in nuclear firestorms, and it would be his fault for not passing along the warning. 20 minutes passed. No explosions, no mushroom clouds, no end of the world. The satellite system had been wrong. A rare alignment of sunlight and clouds had created infrared signatures that the computer interpreted as missile launches. The technology had failed. The system designed to prevent surprise attacks had nearly caused one. Stanislav Petrov, a man who was only at that post because he was covering someone else's shift, had just prevented World War III by trusting human judgment over computer data, and almost nobody knew it had happened. The world that almost was, if Petrov had followed protocol that night, if he'd trusted the computers instead of his instincts, the sequence of events would have been swift and irreversible. A Soviet High Command would have received his report of an American nuclear launch. They would have had approximately 8 minutes to decide whether the attack was real and what to do about it. In that state of heightened tension, with Soviet leadership already convinced that the United States was preparing for war, With the KGB warning that NATO exercises might be cover for a first strike, the most likely decision would have been to launch a full counterstrike immediately. Soviet nuclear doctrine was clear. If the Americans launch, you launch everything before their missiles destroy your ability to respond. Use it or lose it. Soviet missiles would have lifted off from silos across the Soviet Union within minutes. Submarine-launched missiles would have fired from positions in the Atlantic and Pacific. Bombers would have taken off with nuclear payloads. The United States' early warning systems would have detected the Soviet launch, and American leadership would have had the same impossible choice. Were the Soviets launching a first strike, or were they responding to something? Either way, the response would be the same: launch everything. Within 30 minutes of Petrov's false alarm, thousands of nuclear weapons would have been in the air, targeting cities across the northern hemisphere: Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, New York, Washington, Los Angeles, London, Paris, Berlin. Each city would have been hit by multiple warheads, each one tens or hundreds of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The heat from the explosions would have vaporized everything within miles of ground zero. The blast waves would have flattened cities. Firestorms would have consumed what remained. Tens of millions would have died in the first hour. Hundreds of millions more would have died in the days and weeks that followed from radiation poisoning, burns, and injuries with no medical system left to treat them. But the devastation wouldn't have stopped there. The massive firestorms from burning cities would have sent enormous amounts of smoke and soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight across the planet. Temperatures would have plummeted, crops would have failed. This is what scientists call nuclear winter, and it would have lasted for years. Billions of people who survived the initial explosions would have faced starvation as global agriculture collapsed. The southern hemisphere, barely touched by the actual weapons, would have suffered mass famine as the climate changed and food supplies ran out. Human civilization as we know it would have ended. Not completely, perhaps. Some people in remote areas might have survived. But the world of cities and nations and global commerce and technological progress would have been over, replaced by a dark age of survival and scarcity that could have lasted centuries. All because of 5 false alarms on a computer screen. All because the sun reflected off clouds in a way that a satellite misinterpreted. All because one man had to make a decision in a few terrifying minutes with the fate of humanity in his hands. The man who said no. So why did Petrov make the choice he did? In interviews years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the story finally became public, Petrov explained his reasoning. He was trained as an engineer, not a military officer. He understood how technology could fail. He knew that the satellite system was relatively new and might have flaws, and most importantly, he couldn't make sense of why the United States would launch just 5 missiles. A real nuclear first strike would be massive and overwhelming. This looked wrong. It felt wrong. So he trusted that feeling over what the computers were telling him. But it wasn't just rational analysis. It was also courage. Petrov knew that if he was wrong, if those 5 missiles were real and just the beginning of a larger attack, he would be blamed for the deaths of millions. He would be court-martialed, imprisoned, or worse. Soviet military culture didn't tolerate failure, especially not failure that got people killed. By reporting a false alarm instead of a real attack, he was risking his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. He made that choice anyway. He decided that the risk of starting World War III by mistake was worse than the risk of being wrong about an incoming attack. The Soviet military never publicly acknowledged what happened that night. Petrov was neither punished nor rewarded. He was quietly reassigned to a less sensitive position and eventually retired from the military. For years, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet officers knew how close the world had come to nuclear war. It wasn't until the late 1990s, after the Cold War ended and Soviet archives began to open, that historians discovered the incident and tracked down Petrov to hear his story. When the world finally learned what he'd done, he became known as the man who saved the world, though Petrov himself was uncomfortable with that title. He insisted he was just doing his job, making the best decision he could with the information he had. Able Archer and the Second Close Call. But September 26th wasn't the only time in 1983 that nuclear war nearly started. Just 6 weeks later, in November, NATO launched the Able Archer 83 exercise that Soviet intelligence had been dreading. It was supposed to be a routine training exercise simulating NATO's response to a Soviet attack on Western Europe. NATO forces would practice transitioning from conventional warfare to nuclear warfare, moving through different alert levels as the simulated conflict escalated. It was the kind of exercise they'd done before, but this time, and NATO added some new realistic elements that made it look much more like an actual war preparation. They used new encrypted communication formats that Soviet intelligence couldn't decode. They moved forces in ways that matched what NATO would do in a real conflict. High-level officials, including people who would have authority to order nuclear weapons use in a real war, participated in the exercise. From the Soviet perspective, watching through their intelligence networks, it looked exactly like what they'd feared: the United States and NATO preparing for a nuclear first strike disguised as a training exercise. The Soviet Union responded by putting their nuclear forces on high alert. For several days during Able Archer 83, Soviet nuclear bombers were loaded, fueled, and ready to launch on short notice. Our Soviet intelligence watched frantically for any sign that NATO was about to go from exercise mode to actual attack mode. If they saw anything that suggested NATO was transitioning to real war, the orders were clear: launch a preemptive strike before NATO could hit them first. Once again, the world was balanced on a knife edge, and most people had no idea. Western intelligence eventually picked up on the Soviet reaction and realized how seriously the Soviets were taking the exercise. NATO quietly scaled back some of the more realistic elements of Able Archer to avoid further escalation. The exercise ended without incident. Soviet forces stood down. But when American and British leaders were briefed on how close the Soviets had come to launching a preemptive strike, they were genuinely shocked. President Reagan later wrote in his diary that he'd had no idea the Soviets were that frightened of American intentions. The realization that the Soviet Union might actually believe the United States was preparing to attack them and might launch their own attack to preempt it was a wake-up call. It led to a gradual thawing of relations, more direct communication between Soviet and American leadership, and eventually the arms reduction treaties that helped end the Cold War. The legacy of the year. The world almost ended. 1983 became a turning point, though not in the way anyone expected. Instead of being the year World War III started, it became the year that both superpowers realized just how close they were to destroying each other by accident. The near misses and false alarms exposed how fragile the system of nuclear deterrence really was. It wasn't just about rational actors making calculated decisions. It was about human beings with incomplete information, operating under enormous stress, relying on imperfect technology, trying to make life-or-death decisions in minutes. And sometimes it was about one person, like Stanislav Petrov, having the courage to say no when the system told him to say yes. The aftermath of 1983 saw significant changes in how the superpowers managed their nuclear arsenals. Direct communication lines between Washington and Moscow were strengthened. Protocols were revised to reduce the chances of false alarms triggering actual launches. Our intelligence sharing improved to avoid the kind of misunderstanding that happened during Able Archer. Most importantly, political leaders on both sides became more aware of how dangerous the Cold War brinkmanship had become, which contributed to the diplomatic breakthroughs of the late 1980s. But the incident also revealed something troubling that remains relevant today. We came within minutes of nuclear war not because of deliberate aggression or evil intent, but because of technical failures, miscommunication, and mutual fear. The system designed to protect both sides from surprise attack nearly caused the very war it was supposed to prevent. And it was prevented not by perfect technology or foolproof protocols, but by one person's instinct that something was wrong. Today, more countries have nuclear weapons than did in 1983. The technology is more sophisticated but also more complex and potentially vulnerable to cyber attacks or technical glitches. The Cold War is over, but new tensions have emerged. The lesson of Stanislav Petrov's night in that bunker remains urgent. The stakes of getting it wrong are so catastrophically high that we need human judgment, clear communication, and the courage to question what the computers are telling us. September the 26th, 1983. A man you've probably never heard of made a decision that meant you were born, or if you were already alive, that you didn't die in nuclear fire. He went against protocol, against the computers, against everything his training told him to do. He bet the world on his instinct that something didn't add up. And he was right. The missiles were never coming. The system had failed. The technology that was supposed to save us nearly killed us. History didn't change that day. The world kept spinning. The Cold War continued for another 6 years before it finally ended. Most people never knew how close they came to not having a tomorrow. But in that bunker beneath Moscow, Stanislav Petrov faced the weight of billions of lives and chose to trust human judgment over machine precision. He made the right call, and the world survived to see another morning. We're all living in the timeline where one man said no to nuclear war when every system around him was screaming yes. Think about that the next time you complain about your Monday morning. You have Monday mornings because of him. If you enjoyed this story about a moment when history almost changed, make sure to subscribe. More unbelievable almost happened events are coming every week. And yeah, after hearing all that, if your biggest problem today was a slow internet connection, a late coffee, or an annoying meeting that could have been an email, just remember this. At least nobody accidentally started World War III because of a computer glitch while the sun bounced off some clouds. Some days really are bad, but some days are the world almost ended and you didn't even notice bad. So maybe take a deep breath, appreciate your very normal non-nuclear day, and thank one quiet guy in a bunker who trusted his gut.
If you watched this and thought, that was way too close, then you're in the right place. Because history almost changed more times than you think. Sometimes it only takes one decision to change everything. Subscribe for more stories about the moments that almost changed the world.